Hey everybody, a few weeks ago I put out a video that showed how to paint the bumper of my truck, and in that video I described how to paint the entire panel, and I had a lot of questions and comments about, well, what if there's damage in only one little tiny part of a much bigger panel? How do I blend that paint in? In this video I have exactly that situation. My friend's truck here unfortunately ran into a construction road sign, and it wound up getting a lot of damage right here on this corner of the hood. So today I'm going to show you how I can just take care of fixing this little spot of damage without painting the entire hood. Let's get started. We'll start by removing the hood. Now this is completely optional, but for a truck this size it's a lot more convenient to be able to have the panel we'll be working on down at an easier height. Thankfully for this hood it's a relatively quick process, and in no time we have the hood out and sitting on a couple of sawhorses. Let's get a little closer look at the damage. He parked next to a construction sign on a flexible base during a really windy day, and while he was away from the truck, the wind wound up banging the edge of the sign into the corner of his hood, which caused a lot of these deep scratches. Before we even start working on the truck, it's a good idea to check to make sure the paint we have is going to be a good match. My buddy picked this paint up from R&E Paints Online. Now this is not a sponsored video, they have no idea that I'm making it, and he paid full price for the paint. But I've used paint from them in the past on several different projects, and I've always had really great results. So if you're looking for paint for your car or truck, I do highly recommend them. To get a good match on your paint color, you can look inside the door jamb of the driver's door, and you should be able to find a paint code for your vehicle. It's usually just on a sticker there. Use this code to order paint and it should be a really good match. Now I like to verify this, so I recommend spraying out 2 coats of the paint on a white note card or similar piece of photo paper, and then follow that up with a coat of clear. While that dries, we'll clean and lightly buff the area where we'll be working, so it's easier to see if the paint's a good match. And as you can see here, the paint we'll be using is perfect. We'll start the repair by sanding down the area of damage. I'm starting with 180 grit wrapped around a small block of wood with relatively light pressure. This grit is quite aggressive and will sand down through the factory clear coat, the paint, and the primer all the way to the bare metal relatively quickly. The goal at this stage is to get all of the damaged area completely removed and to feather the edges of the sanded area out to the factory finish with a smooth gradient. I like to take my time here and stop every little while to wipe down the area with a damp cloth. This makes it very easy to tell what progress I've made and when I'm down to the bare metal. Once all the damaged paint has been removed and I have a nice gradient out to the factory finish, I switch to progressively finer grits of sandpaper, going over everything I've already sanded in slightly progressively larger areas. This smooths out the surface and widens the transition between the bare metal and the factory finish. I'll move up in grits from 180 to 220, then 320, followed by 400, 600, and finally to 1000. After a final check to make sure I'm happy with the transition from the original paint to the bare metal, it's time to apply some primer. I'll quickly clean the area with some solvent. I'm using Prep All here, but again, not sponsored. Use whatever you'd like. Just make sure that there's no wax or grease or oils from your skin still left on the surface. Once it's cleaned and dried, we're ready to apply primer. I'll put on a light coat at first, and then once that's flashed off, I'll follow it up with a heavier second coat. Then we'll wet sand that primer using 1000 grit paper to remove overspray and make sure that the transition between the original paint and the repaired area is as smooth as possible. As we work through this step, it's very helpful to have a microfiber cloth on hand to check for areas that are still rough. Okay, so let's stop there because the next test is with a microfiber. We get it really wet, just saturate it. And then when you drag a microfiber across it, you will feel where it's still rough.
Oh yeah, where it catches.
So it is, this whole edge is good. Up here though, there's still a lot of roughness. So feel that with the microfiber. Feel how it's rough there, and then come and roll over here and you'll feel the difference.
Oh yeah, that's
night and day, right? Mm-hmm. So you can totally tell where it's still rough. Once all the rough areas are smooth and the primer is blended in well, we're ready for paint. Alright, we have finished with all the prep work. We sanded down all the damaged area and then very carefully put down 2 coats of primer and sanded that as well so that it's blended in perfectly with the surface of the paint. So we're ready to start laying down coats of paint. Now, I want to make sure I'm not going to paint the entire hood because I don't have enough paint for that today, and also because there's no reason to have to paint the whole hood. So I put a drop cloth here, and I want to make sure just that's going to protect from any excess overspray. And remember, the damage was only just right here. We are going to wind up painting most of this area here, but then we're going to feather it in before we get to the drop cloth, and that's kind of the trick for being able to paint a section of a panel without painting the entire panel. Let me show you the technique. I'll start with a pretty light coat of paint first, and note that I'm focusing only on covering the primed area. I'm not going to go all the way out to where the drop cloth is. Everything outside of the primed area is still covered by the factory clear coat, so there's really no reason to paint over it. Also note that I've purposely not taped down the drop cloth, as that would force a hard edge to form where there's a little bit of overspray. Leaving the edges loose will make that transition just a little bit wider. Here's a better look at the first coat while it's flashing off, and notice just how light it is. Now don't go heavy here, as that will very easily cause runs. Now currently, this looks pretty terrible, but that's on purpose. Later coats will even things out and look great. Speaking of those later coats, here I'm applying the second coat. I'm going just a little bit heavier than the first, but still keeping things pretty light. And here's a good look after applying the second coat while it's still wet. You can easily tell where I've painted and how I've stopped sort of midway between the damaged area and the drop cloth. The third and fourth coats of paint are applied in much the same as the prior coats. Keep it fairly light and make sure that you've covered all the primer completely. Feather out the edges as much as you can. Once I finish all the paint, it's time to pull back the drop cloth and clean up the edge that it leaves. You can see where we had the tarp, there's a little bit of line of overspray of paint. And while I think that would probably blend in just fine with the clear coat, I've got a very small buffing pad here, and I'm going to buff from this face just to that corner, just to blend in that paint as much as I can. So let's see what we get by doing that. Fresh paint is very easily removed with a little buffing pad and some polishing compound, and I very quickly have that line left from the tarp cleaned up and removed. At this point, we are finished with all of the paint. I put, I think, 3.5-ish sort of coats, maybe more like 4 coats of paint on. And I was careful as I was covering the paint to make sure the heaviest part of it was here, and then I sort of feathered it out all the way towards this edge and then up to this crease in the hood. And we did have some overspray that came over the top of the crease of the hood, and I just used a buffer to remove that. So now here is just factory finish with factory clear coat, and then it sort of transitions across this little part of the hood to where we've got new paint. When I put on the clear, I'm going to again focus most of the clear here. We'll have some overspray that will come up over here, and we'll just buff that out to match again after it's had a couple of days to cure. And that's really the best way to feather in a very small area that needed to be repaired on a much larger panel. We won't wind up having to paint this entire thing. Pretty much all of it's going to be just in this little area right here. This clip shows just how wide my transition area is from the factory finish to the new paint. Watch how the reflection of the light completely fades away as I move the camera around. That wide transition is key to being able to paint only a small area of a much larger panel. Once the new clear coat has been applied and buffed, the transition from the old to the new paint will completely disappear. The clear coat is applied in much the same way as I did the paint. I'll start with a somewhat light coat at first, and then I'll come back with several more sort of light to medium coats. Oh, and one very important tip I can share. Make sure that you grab the right can while you're applying clear. Here's where I made a pretty big mistake. You know, sometimes you screw up. And I grabbed the can that I thought was clear and I started to put on coat number 2 of clear, and that's primer. It's a good thing we still have a little bit of paint left over. I'm just gonna cover this up and we'll pretend that never happened. After fixing that little mistake, I finished off the rest of the coats of clear on the repaired area. I believe I did 4 coats of clear in total. And this is the final result. There is a pretty good orange peel texture on this, but it is still wet. That will settle down as it cures. And we are going to come back and do a polish and possibly a wet sand, because there is a little bit of overspray, which was expected and anticipated over this area right here. So over here is the original factory finish, factory clear. Nothing's been touched here at all. You can see here where the overspray happened under, or right in front of where that tarp was. And then over here you can see where we've got nice, fairly thick, fresh new clear coat that's been applied. So we're gonna let this cure for several days. We'll actually get this back on the truck later today after it's had time to cure enough to handle. And then my friend's gonna come back and we will take care of moving this transition to the point you won't be able to see it, and we'll do that by doing a combination of probably wet sanding and polishing just right in this area. And then once we've done that, we can look at the eggshell or the orange peel here once it's actually cured, and if it's significantly different than here, then we can do more wet sanding and polishing to be able to clean that up as well. But the original damaged area now looks factory fresh. It's beautiful. All of the damage is completely gone, and you can't see any evidence that it was ever there. So far, we've finished all of these steps in a single Saturday afternoon. Even with all of the filming, which always adds a lot of time to any project, it's very easy to get to this point in an automotive painting project like this in just a few hours. Once the final coat of clear was dry to the touch, we reinstalled his hood and checked all the panel gaps. Here you can easily see the factory finish on the fender, which we didn't touch at all, compared to the fresh paint on the edge of the hood. Now there's more orange peel and texture on the hood where we've painted, but as I explained, we'll address that in a few days with a quick wet sand and buff on the new clear. Alright, it's been 4 days since we last worked on this hood. We left it with some overspray on purpose, and I wanted to let some time elapse so that that clear coat could cure up and get nice and hard. Because our next step is to wet sand and then buff both the new area as well as all of that overspray. And this is sort of the secret step that's going to perfectly blend the old factory finish in this area here with the new area that we've painted and cleared. Let me show you those steps next. I start with a very light wet sand using 800 grit paper and a sanding block. It's easy to both hear and feel the surface change as the paper gently pulls off the overspray and smooths out some of that orange peel. Again, I'm using very light pressure. We're looking for a consistent finish across the whole hood, so I'll wet sand everywhere that I've applied any paint or clear coat, including all of the overspray areas. Mostly I am feeling the surface for when it goes smooth, because it starts rough, and then sort of instantly it goes, whoop, now we're smooth. And you can feel it in the sandpaper. As I work through this process, periodically I'll wipe down the entire hood with diluted isopropyl alcohol and a microfiber cloth to check the progress and make sure I've not missed anything important. So this is effectively just rinsing off all of the sanded off clear. And then we are going to probably let it dry or get close to. And what we're looking for is a pretty consistent cloudiness across the whole thing. At least the whole thing that I sanded, not this upper area, of course. You can totally see we're back to factory here. Yep. There's still some overspray here. Because as it evaporates, it'll go from that nice dark black to, oh my goodness, what did you do to my hood? A heat gun can be very helpful here to help things dry quickly, but make sure that you don't heat up the surface too much. At this point, we're just looking for a consistently cloudy finish everywhere that I've sanded. Just keep repeating this process until all the overspray has been blended in perfectly with the new finish and everything's been sanded to the same consistency. This part of the finish work is somewhat tedious, but take your time and don't rush. 800 grit is very fine but can still remove quite a lot of material, so I recommend checking progress very often. Once we had everything looking consistently even with the 800 grit, we moved up to 2000 grit and repeated the same process. Expect the sanding down with the 800 grit to take the longest, as you'll use that step to even out everything on the panel, which can take a lot of elbow grease. Once you move on to the later grits though, they go much more quickly, as all you're really doing at that point is refining the finish from the previous pass. This is what we've got after doing 2000. So we started with 800, moved up to 2000, and we're doing that entire area where there was any overspray at all. Next we'll go to 3000 and then to polishing. The final grit we used is 3000, again going over everything very carefully and checking progress along the way frequently. After we finish the 3000, there's a faint line between the clear overspray area and the original factory finish. At this point I was hopeful it would disappear during buffing, so we moved on to that step. Here's the first polishing compound I'll start with. It's a medium compound that will cut well to clean up all the cloudiness from the sanding and start to bring back the shine. I did another whole video covering how to polish paint, and this process is the same that I demonstrated there, so I won't go into a ton of detail. The same principles apply here though as when sanding. Work in an area, clean it off, and dry it to check your progress. Repeat until the whole panel looks great. I've polished this lower part, but not up here yet. Here's how things look after one pass of the medium polish compound. There are definitely still some swirls in the paint that you can see in this light, but it's pretty reflective already, and you can see my hand in the reflection. However, we also have a definite line between the factory and the new clear coat, so we need to address that before finishing our polishing. To fix this line, I went back a step to the 3000 grit sandpaper and then back to the 2000 grit, being careful to focus only on the upper portion of the hood. This allowed me to hide the transition right at the crease along the bend in the panel. Then I went back with a pass of polish to see how things were looking. Through this process of back and forth, I was able to learn what would and would not really work for this specific job on this specific panel. And I found that a few more light passes with 2000 grit and then 3000 and then polishing did the trick to fix this line entirely. Your mileage may vary, of course, so you may want to think about planning carefully on the panel that you're working on to consider the body lines that may aid in hiding a transition like this. I'd like to mention one other quick point here. This transition line was definitely caused by a difference in the clear coats, the factory finish versus what I used. So this transition is just a difference of how the new clear settled on top of the old. Also, the lighting and the camera settings I'm using here are designed to very clearly show any and all very subtle flaws in the finish. In person, you could barely even see this. So keep in mind, there's a variety of different clear coat options out there, and maybe another one would have matched the factory clear better, or maybe another one would have been even worse. The bottom line here is that when you're blending a repair into a larger panel, expect that there may be some hiccups along the way, and you may have to go back and repeat steps to get things to look great. Once we'd fixed the overspray line, the rest of the process went smoothly. I polished the whole hood with a medium compound and then moved on to a fine finishing compound. When I was satisfied that the hood would match the rest of the body, we reinstalled the hood and checked our work. As you can see here, the surface finish is now a great match in the repaired area with the rest of the truck, particularly in the transition between the hood and the fender. Notice that this is not a brand new truck and did not come with a showroom shine to start. It's got some swirls in the paint, so I was careful not to overdo the polish on the hood so that it wouldn't look too out of place against the factory finish on the quarter panel, and I think I nailed it. My buddy was very happy with the final result. Here are some close-ups of the area that was damaged, and as you can see, it looks perfect now. Walking up and looking even very closely, you'd never know that this area had been repaired. And here's a quick shot out in the sunlight, which really helps to show just how well the finishes match. Well, that's about all there is to this repair. As you can see, it's not that complicated or intimidating. If you've got some light damage on a relatively large panel, you can actually take care of that yourself, and it doesn't cost all that much. It doesn't really take all that long. You will need some patience, and you might have to pick up a couple of little tools like that polisher that I used. But hey, then you've got a polisher and you can fix your buddy's truck when he winds up getting some damage on his hood. Hey, if you've enjoyed this video or learned a little something, you can let me know about that with a thumbs up down below. If you've got some ideas of some things I could have done a little bit better or differently, you can let me know about that down in the comments. And if you'd like to see more content like this, you can always think about subscribing, but there's never any pressure from me, of course. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Looking pretty good. Well, as you can see, fixing some light damage like this when someone starts their engine behind you and ruins all your audio, you just got to start all over again.
Remember to wear your PPE.
And that's really all there is to this sort of a situation, job, repair. Well, hopefully you can see repairing some light damage like this. Whew, can't lean on that. Turns out. Well, hopefully you can see doing a repair like this on a large body panel is not as complicated or intimidating. That's the word. I was going to say enticing. That's not the word.
That's not the word.
That's not the word. Now I just have to remember not to touch the top half while I'm over here working on things, because we got to reconnect a few things. Hopefully you can see that doing a simple repair on a little panel, big panel, sometimes when I'm recording, I get stuck in my own head and I'll wind up, it's going to take 30 takes. And then we've got traffic and other traffic and sorry, how long do you have?